Joining me now is Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland, a member of the January 6th Select Committee. And Congressman, thank you so much for being here. I want to go back through some of the evidence that we actually have seen during the January 6th hearings that I think is really important and makes this case really important. Going back, Washington Post reported that 4 days after the January 6th insurrection, Rhodes was recorded trying to tell Donald Trump that it was not too late to use paramilitary groups to stay in power by force, but expressed regret about not bringing guns and doing it himself, saying if he's not going to do the right thing and he's just going to let himself be removed illegally, then we should have brought rifles. We should have fixed it right then and there. I'd hang, as we just heard Ryan Riley report, effing Pelosi from the lamppost. And messages between Kelly Meggs and Stewart Rhodes in late December about January 6th. One said, we're thinking that this is the plan. He, meaning Trump, wants us to get us kicked off. Post 2 about what Trump tweeted about, it's going to be wild. It's going to be wild. It's going to be wild. He wants us to make it wild. That's what he's saying. He called us to the Capitol, and he wants us to make it wild. Sir, yes, sir. Gentlemen, we're heading to D.C. Pack your S. In your view, do these convictions, particularly of these two, Kelly Meggs and Elmer Stewart Rhodes, push us closer to a potential indictment of the man they did it for, Donald Trump?
Well, seditious conspiracy means conspiracy to overthrow or put down the government of the United States. And there were significant elements that were part of the vanguard of the mob who stormed our windows and assaulted our officers, who clearly were set upon the goal that Donald Trump had outlined of stopping the steal. In other words, interfering with the federal function of counting electoral college votes and then storming the Capitol to drive the House, the Senate, and the Vice President out of the chambers and out of the legitimate process and replacing it with something else that would lead to Donald Trump seizing the presidency. So I think that the Oath Keepers were just one element of the insurrectionary forces that were unleashed on that day. The way to think about the insurrectionary and coup-like activities taking place were that they were a mega offense against American constitutional democracy, and then there were all of these discrete individual criminal offenses committed by these hundreds and hundreds of people who are being prosecuted, many of whom are pleading guilty, but others who are being convicted, and some of whom are being acquitted, all of which demonstrates that the American system of justice is working, and these are fine-grained, subtle decisions that a jury of their peers is making.
But, I mean, the reason I ask about Trump is that, let me play for a second. This is Enrique Tarrio and Stewart Rhodes together. So let's just look. This is 3 for my director. So we know that if we're talking about seditious conspiracy, you had the Proud Boys, who Donald Trump had previously said, stand back and stand by. They immediately respond on social media saying, sir, yes, sir, we're standing back and standing by. Then you have the paramilitary Oath Keepers and 3 percenters. These groups are meeting in advance. You still have not had the trials of Enrique Tarrio and the Proud Boys. This suggests to me that they might be in some trouble, right, if they were able to prove this very difficult charge, seditious conspiracy. But can you have a seditious conspiracy to overthrow the government on behalf of a particular president and have that president not be both the beneficiary and a part of the conspiracy?
Well, there's no doubt that he was the beneficiary, and if he were part of that specific conspiracy involving the Oath Keepers and Stewart Rhodes, then he would need to be prosecuted for those charges. What the January 6th committee found is that his tweet calling everybody to Washington at exactly the time, place, and date that Congress was meeting in joint session to count the electoral college votes was the tweet heard around the right-wing internet, and that mobilized and catalyzed all of these groups into action. So there's no doubt in my mind that that call to action was what led to the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the other domestic violent extremist groups mobilizing for that day. That's different, though, from saying that he was part of that particular conspiracy. And if he was part of particular criminal conspiracies, that case would have to be made against him, that there was a meeting of the minds between him and other co-conspirators, and that they took an overt act to advance the conspiracy. But I believe that there has been a lot of evidence adduced through a bunch of these hearings that would suggest there's sufficient evidence to prosecute Donald Trump for that. But that's just, my own take on it. And obviously, this is up to the Department of Justice and the executive branch at this point. But people should turn over all of the evidence they've gotten. People should come forward to testify about what they know. And I'm glad that the January 6th committee has been part of that process of surfacing all of the evidence.
We know that Tony Ornato testified before the January 6th committee, that you all are putting all these puzzle pieces together. And I guess I stick with this because you have Donald Trump insisting that he wanted to march to the Capitol. He clearly understood that something was going to happen at the Capitol that, per what we've heard in the January 6th hearings, he wanted to be a part of. He wanted to be a part of a certain spectacle. We knew that he called these folks. You know what January 6th is and the significance of it because you're a constitutional scholar and an expert. I'm a nerd, so I knew what January 6th is. Most Americans really never attached much of a importance to this date. It's not like a commonly known date like January 20th is, right? The inauguration date. Yep. So the fact that he educated people as to this date being important, and the fact that he produced this kind of response. Here is Stewart Rhodes himself talking about Trump's sort of vision and what he believed Trump wanted to see. This is cut 4. Play this, please.
He needs to know from you that you are with him, that he does not do it now while he is commander-in-chief. We're going to have to do it ourselves later in a much more desperate, much more bloody war. Let's get it on now while he is still the commander-in-chief. Hooah!
CNN just said that they evacuated all members of Congress into a safety room.
There's no safe place in the United States for any of these right now, let me tell you.
I hope they understand that we are not joking around.
Military Principle 105. Military Principle 105. Cave means grave.
Trump just tweeted, please support our Capitol Police. They are on our side. Do not harm them.
That's saying a lot by what he didn't say. He didn't say not to do anything to the congressman.
And you were very familiar with that. That was recordings of Stewart Rhodes. That was the first clip that we saw. The second bit was various Oath Keepers talking on their own radios on that day. And so I guess my sort of outro question to you, Congressman, is, does the conviction of these men, all 5 on some charges, 2 on seditious conspiracies, coming trials for more members of what we now understand to have been a seditious conspiracy to overthrow the government, to overturn an election, make it more likely, in your opinion, that the January 6th committee, when you finish your work at the end of this year, will send over your recommendations that the Justice Department go forward with this prosecution? I know that there's a special counsel, but is that what you think the January 6th committee will recommend?
Well, let me just say that, in our system of justice, the determined guilt of defendants in a particular case does not imply the guilt of defendants in another case. And, people are obviously impatient for justice because this was such an outrageous assault on the American system of government and our constitutional democracy. But each of these defendants, including potentially Donald Trump, if he is indicted and prosecuted, gets to put on their own defense, and the government must sustain the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that every element of the offense has been met, which is what the government had to show in the Oath Keepers case. But just to go back to the point that you made before, Donald Trump, from the standpoint of democracy, set all of these events into motion. The groups that were planning to protest Biden were calling for protests either on January 20th, the day of the inauguration, or after January 20th, when I think the Women for America First group had gotten its permits. And then Trump and his forces got everybody to move the protests up to January 6th at 1 p.m. at the Capitol, and that's when he began to mobilize everybody's attention directly on the Capitol to stop the steal. In other words, to go in and to interfere with the counting of Electoral College votes, which of course is what happened. And it was preceded by all of his statements about how you've got to fight like hell. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. When there's fraud involved, there are completely different rules, and so on. So all of that led to both a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate finding that Donald Trump had incited an insurrection against the government of the United States. So I guess in answer to your question, I would say Congress has already determined that there was incitement to an insurrection which took place here, and now there are criminal convictions of people for seditious conspiracy, for conspiracy to overthrow the government. It doesn't prove anything in advance about other cases, but it certainly demonstrates the character and the magnitude of the violence that rained down upon us on January the 6th.